Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background while reading this work. This is Passerine, Chapter 5, Part 2. The same trigger warnings apply from last time. But Wilbur was already rushing to his feet. Before Technoblade could say another word, Wilbur ran. Don't. The warning was soft, but brooked no argument. Techno stopped at the edge of the tent where he'd been readying to chase after Wilbur, turning towards the sound of Phil's voice. Philza had gathered Tommy's body into his arms, but he was looking right at Techno. He needs his space, Phil continued, his blue eyes almost gray in the dim light. How would you know? Techno wanted to say, but his gaze fell and caught on Tommy. What was left of his anger evaporated into mist as he took in the state of his pupil. The blood and mud still on his skin and clothes, the dagger still protruding from his small, unbreathing chest. Phil had held the boy with infinite gentleness. Tommy's head nestled against the crook of his arm, Tommy's cheek pressed against his chest, exactly like how one would hold a newborn babe. Techno wondered when the last time Phil had held Tommy like that was, if Tommy even allowed him to, over the age of 3, and realized it did not really matter. A father's arms never forgot the shape of a child. Not that Techno knew anything about being a father or being a son. Techno nodded begrudgingly at Philza. And we need to clean Tommy. Phil looked down at the body in his arms, his expression cloudy. I suppose we should. They moved quietly, carefully. Techno grabbed the cloth he dropped during his tussle with Wilbur and went to wet it in the rain again, lingering in the cold to let the raindrops wash away the blood on his knuckles, Wilbur's blood. His stomach tightened as the blood-stained water dripped from his hands, but in a few moments his hands were clean once more. When he turned back to Tommy and Phil, he'd found that Phil had taken the knife from Tommy's chest. Is this yours? Phil asked bitterly, running his hand over the knife's carved handle. You should know, Techno said. You gave it to me. Phil looked up in surprise. Techno could only shrug, unsure of where they stood now with each other. It was a long time ago, Techno said. You gave me a whole set. During the... Yes, Techno cut him off. During that time. For the first time, Phil seemed to look his age, ancient and weathered by his endless years. Techno could see him remembering it all. Their empire of blood and glory, broken only by silent months of a warm companionship. It seemed their bodies were called just as much as their minds did, because they slipped easily into their grim work, side by side, never needing to speak a single word. As Phil combed the dirt out of Tommy's hair, Techno scrubbed at the stains on his arms and the stubborn one on his cheek. And when Techno's breathing began to slow at the sight of the jagged wound on Tommy's chest, Phil silently worked Tommy out of his torn shirt and into a fresh one that did not bear the scars of their battle. Then they stepped back, surveying their work. Tommy was polished. Tommy was spotless. Tommy was dead. Of all the things that could have broken him, Techno didn't understand why it had to be the sight of Tommy actually looking clean. He'd held it together when they were walking back to the camp. He'd held it together when Wilbur pinned him with accusations that simply echoed what the voices had been saying for years. Monster, monster, monster. He'd killed 1,000 men, seen allies eviscerated and witnessed the fall of kingdoms. He'd seen Philza kneel. He'd seen the world end 100 times over and watched its people rebuild it over and over while he stood back, helpless, wanting to scream at them for being foolish but also yearning, with all his might, to be able to love something enough to also love what grew from its ruins. And looking at Tommy's peaceful face was what finally made Technoblade, Emperor of Ice, Blood God, Destroyer of Worlds, cry. He stood over Tommy's body and let the tears fall. He felt himself come undone with grief and guilt, misery and madness, and all at once he understood. He understood the anguish in the war god's eyes. He understood the pain of the widows and orphans he had left in his wake. He understood the agony of an entire world brought to its knees before a merciless God, and he felt it all. A hand closed around his trembling shoulder. Techno. Phil's voice was a distant thing. We need to talk. Talk? Techno whirled around, shrugging Phil's hand off his shoulders. The other gods simply backed away, giving Techno his space. Techno hated that almost as much as the blank look on Phil's face. What is there to talk about? About, Philza swallowed, leaning against the table, as if he could not bear his own weight any longer. About why I left. Your son is dead. The words tasted like ash on his tongue. His corpse is right in front of you, and you want to talk about yourself? Philza flinched, but that was the extent of his reaction. This is important. You have to understand. What is there left for me to understand? It's not over. Philza's eyes bore through him. The war isn't over. Techno exhaled heavily. Don't screw with me right now. I'm done. I'm finished. Would it help, Philza said slowly, if I told you the leader of the Green Army, its general, its ruler, whatever, is still out there? Techno blinked, hot tears still stinging his eyes. What? Philza's lips drew into a thin line, a habit Techno recognized from their Empire days as something Philza did when he was trying not to scream. I left for 1,000 different reasons, Techno. When she died, I just knew. Though the pain of losing her was more than I could bear, I knew something worse would come. And it did come, sooner than I expected, but it came. He glanced at Tommy, his expression undecipherable. Her death destroyed me, but I knew the day I lost my sons would be the day I destroyed the world. His eyes slid to Techno. You understand that, I think. I do. Technoblade did not want to agree with him on anything, but there was no other explanation for the voices slowly getting louder and louder inside his head. He was beginning to lose himself. He already had, if he'd hurt Wilbur like that. It had only been a few hours. There was no telling what he could do, what he would become later. He stared at Philza, for once realizing that the Angel of Death might be called that for a reason. We gods are different. Our grief is infinite, but so is our power. Philza looked down at his hands. No being should have both. Grief and immortal already does so much freaking damage. In us, it will be 1,000 times worse. So I did the only thing I felt could save me. Save everyone from my grief. Blue eyes found red. Have you heard of the Green God, Technoblade? Techno found himself nodding. The Green God, an infamous force, but a mystery to all. Technoblade had found the name carved into trees older than civilizations and written into mortals' holy texts. Philza smiled. The Green God could bring him back. The rest of the world fell away, and in its place, hope. That's why a single tear, the last of its kind, the last Techno could give, fell down Techno's cheek, warm and light. That's why you aren't breaking down right now? Oh, Philza gave him a sad smile. Believe me, old friend, I am completely losing it. It's just that I have had more practice at hiding it than you. Knowing I can revive my son doesn't do shirt for the pain of seeing him die in the first place. And your wife. That sobered Philza quickly. I don't know. The text I read, there were millions, had conflicting stories about the Green God's rules, what he can and can't do. They all agree he's powerful, even more powerful than you and me combined, I reckon. But he can bring back Tommy, and right now that's the only thing that matters. Techno was quiet for a moment, simply processing the weight of Philza's revelation. Then he said, Couldn't you have said all that before I broke Wilbur's face? Philza grimaced. I'm sorry, I was, well, losing it, as I said. You know me. Techno nodded. I do know you. Always gone in the aftermath, aren't you? Techno. You could have stayed to explain, Techno said quietly. Or you could have taken me with you. They both knew he wasn't talking about just Tommy anymore. Philza shook his head sadly. What gave me the strength to leave the night my wife died, Techno, was the knowledge that you were staying behind. I'd seen what you were becoming to the boys, and what the boys were becoming to you. I knew I could leave, because they had you. But who did I have, Phil? Techno demanded. Philza's eyes widened. Techno, that's me and you, Techno went on, not hearing anything beyond the pounding of his own heart. That's what you said. So where were you when I was crashing through the entire library's worth of books on history and politics, and goodness darned etiquette, just to fit into a life I never asked for? Where were you when Tommy was waking up from nightmares almost every night, or when Wilbur was pulling his hair out over being king at 16? Where were you when the voices got so loud for the both of us that we had to take turns reminding each other to breathe? There was a sharp crack, startling both Techno and Philza. They looked down at the table Philza had been leaning on, only to find a chunk of it had broken clean off in Phil's hand. Oh. Philza stared uncomprehendibly at the cracking piece in his hand. He looked helplessly at Techno. What do I do now? Technoblade crossed his arms. Apologize for one thing. For the table or for leaving? At Technoblade's unimpressed look, Philza winced. Sorry, that was my awful attempt at humor, I suppose. He took a deep breath, dropping the broken pieces from his hand. I know I have a lot to be sorry for, he began. Techno sighed. There's going to be a but now, isn't there? But, Philza continued, meeting Techno's disappointed stare head-on, something close to sadness flickering over his face. We have the rest of our lives for my atonement. I will apologize to you every minute of every day, once this is all over. I will never stop trying to make it up to you, but it will have to wait once we're safe, once we're all home. He glanced pointedly at Tommy, then back to Techno. Like I said, this war isn't over. The Green God is still out there. This was simply his invitation. An invitation, Techno thought about the thousands of corpses, enemy and ally, buried underneath the rubble of exploded mountains, his trident and whip, still slick with blood. What had the war god said? I'm merely a pawn in this game. Is this all just a joke to him? Philza nodded tightly. He's more god than the both of us. Are you calling me immortal, Philza? That depends, Philza smiled gently. Do you still think of it as an insult? Techno did not reply. Instead, he turned towards the front of the tent, to the rain still raging outside. Someone needs to find Wilbur. Philza found him at the very edge of the hill, kneeling over a cluster of blue flowers, the rain pouring over his shoulders. He seemed numb to the cold, to everything entirely, but when Philza spread his wings over him, keeping the downpour away, his dark eyes flickered to his father, just for a second. Just for a heartbeat, but it was an acknowledgement, which was more than Phil could ever hope to deserve. Techno's words echoed in his head, each syllable leaving bleeding wounds that Phil would never show. Techno had already suffered so much, too much. Phil would rather die than add to that. Whatever apology he could come up with now would be meaningless, a small, pathetic scratch against an iceberg of his own making. Actions, after all, spoke louder than words, and Philza was nothing if not a man of action. King at 16, Techno had said, as if it was the worst thing to be. Now looking down at his son, Philza knew it to be true. Wilbur was holding his own hand in his lap. In the dark, Phil could just barely make out a jagged, barely healed scar on his palm. He wanted to ask a million things at once. Are you okay? Who did that? What happened? Will you ever forgive me? Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. But he held in his silence, even if it was the second most painful thing he had ever done. He waited and waited. He would wait until the world ended, if that was what it took. And then, eventually, Wilbur spoke. It really was meant to be. I'm sorry? Phil asked gently. Yeah, Wilbur sighed heavily. You should be. Well, why didn't you visit? Wilbur asked suddenly. Overhead, lightning arched across the midnight sky, and Phil finally allowed himself to really look at his son. His jaw was sharper, his shoulders broader, but underneath the blood and grime and the haunted eyes, it was still his boy, his Wilbur, terrified of the dark. Or even write a letter? Anything? Phil's heart shattered. Because if I did, if I allowed myself that foot in the door, I knew I wouldn't have had the courage to leave again. And did you ever think of us? Of course, every second of every day. I never thought of you, Wilbur said. Or at least, I tried not to. It was hard. I saw you everywhere, in the paintings, in the garden, down every hallway, in Tommy's eyes, and Techno's words. He closed his scarred hand so tightly that the wound opened once more, spilling blood onto the grass. But what's strange is that I never saw you and me. Thunder echoed over the valley, but Philza barely heard it. I think that's a good thing, Wilbur. No, Wilbur gave a rueful shake of his head. No, it's not. I'm tired of pretending it is. I'm tired of everything. I wish I could just be like you and leave it all behind without looking back. That was enough. Philza went and kneeled before Wilbur, his hands finding Wilbur's shoulders. Wilbur's expression crumpled, and Philza knew it wasn't just rain dripping down his cheeks. Leaving you and Tommy, Philza said, almost killed me. Wilbur, But I knew I had to spare you from exactly this. He shook him slightly, desperately, just to get any sort of emotion behind those cold brown eyes. We can bring him back, Wilbur. This isn't the end. He told Wilbur of his plans, of the years he'd spent hunting down every lead and every whisper of the Green God who could rewrite history, rewind death itself. I know, Philza said. I know this doesn't absolve me of the things I've done. Leaving you when your mother had just... I thought I was protecting you from my world, but I should have understood earlier. You are my world. You and Techno and Tommy. And after this, after the Green God gives us your brother back, we can go home together, and you can be Prince Wilbur again, if you want. Or we can go somewhere else, find a place nobody knows our names, and just be. For a while, Wilbur was silent again. Speak, Philza begged. Please, talk to me. At last, Wilbur said, You know, children don't really care about why their parents leave. They only care that they did. It's a blessing, I suppose, that I never truly was a child, even when I was young. He nodded, once, almost to himself. And how sure are you that the Green God will give us anything, after all he's done? Because I'll make him, the Angel of Death vowed. Wilbur scoffed. Right. Techno told me about you, you know. Well, I guess you told me about Techno first, with your bedtime stories. Every time I prayed to the gods, I've only ever been praying to you. I'm not much of a pious man now. Wilbur gave him a ghost of a smile. But I suppose faith is stronger when tested, right? Before Philza could say anything, Wilbur threw his arms around his father, pulling him into an embrace. Philza stilled, a frozen, unmoving statue in his son's arms. And then he cracked. He leaned into Wilbur, his own arms going around Wilbur and pulling him close. He still remembered the last time Wilbur had allowed himself to be hugged like this by his father. He was older now, and heavier, but that would never matter. Phil had never forgotten his initial hesitation at holding Tommy. That shame would follow him forever, but after that, he'd promised to hold his sons for as long as they would let him, and he had sworn never to be the first one to let go. Phil had spent 9 years, 10 months, 3 days, and 16 hours away from his eldest son, and now, in the rain and in the dark, where nobody could see him cry, he was finally home. Wilbur buried his face in his father's shoulder, clinging on for dear life. This isn't forgiveness, he whispered. I know, Philza whispered back. And you have a hell of a lot more explaining to do. I know. And when we get Tommy back, you'll have to bend over backwards to appease him. That boy holds grudges longer than I do. I know, Wilbur, I know. Phil felt Wilbur nod again. Then that's where we'll start. When they returned, Technoblade was waiting at the mouth of their tent, the light behind him making him barely more than a shadow. In his left hand was a roll of bandages ready for Wilbur's nose. Wilbur found himself grinning, a quip already on his tongue, but was silenced as Techno crossed into the rain and wrapped Wilbur in his arms. Wilbur sunk wordlessly into the god's embrace, and both of them were finally warm. Forgiveness came easily with brothers, after all. The Angel of Death looked on quietly. He would not be welcomed for this moment, not when there was too much between the three of them still. But he knew someday he would be again. One day the four of them would be together in a home full of sunlight. Looking forward to that distant time, Philza finally felt peace. Inside the tent, a golden-haired prince slept on.